Hi, this is the second video in the series on psychotherapy and how the values and practices of psychotherapy might translate to other areas of life. So above and beyond, what psychotherapy is about, which was a little bit more what the introductory video was on. This is then the start of the part of the series where I discuss some of or what I regard to be some of the essential elements of therapy and how those elements might become helpful or useful outside the practice of therapy. I don't know that there's a particular order of importance as conversations or interactions progress. Different values or practices might become more valuable at different times. So, in no descending or ascending order of importance, I thought, let me start somewhere, and the point I wanted to start at was that of the notion of non-judgmentalness, or um, the kind of acceptance that one practices in therapy. Now, the first thing I think that is important is to differentiate between judgment and judgmentalness, or being judgmental. I think it is impossible for any human being living in this world to not impose judgment on experience. So, on the things that we see, that we hear, that we ourselves or other people do, we, I wanted to say, inflict judgment upon these things. Um, Very often, the heuristic that nature has embedded in us would be to give us a feeling about something. And in broad strokes, that those feelings would be something like good or bad, uh, enjoyable, painful. So very often binary kind of categories. Of course, as we grow older and we develop more experience in life, we learn more, we maybe gain some wisdom. Those kinds of judgments can be attenuated or become a little bit more sophisticated. But the judgments are there from an adult perspective, at least, or yeah, let's speak of an adult perspective, almost instantaneously. So we react to what we perceive almost immediately. So we can't help but do that. That seems to me to be part of human nature. Now, of course, the particular judgments that we attribute to something can change. I'm not saying that these are set in stone, so that if you experience a specific something, let's say, uh, let's say somebody experienced sexual trauma early on in their life, and in an adult relationship, they then have a very negative reaction towards any sexual intimacy. That is something that can change. What can't change is that we judge. So not the particular judgment. The particular judgment might change, but the fact that we judge cannot. So being judgmental is then different from judgment. Um, and I would say that being judgmental means that we attribute, that very often we attribute intent to what we perceive. Um, or that we attribute a particular kind of meaning to what we perceive, and very often a negative kind of judgment. Okay, so when speaking about being judgmental, I am going to interchangeably also use judgment, even though I try to differentiate between these two. Um, so please just be aware of that. So when I'm being judgmental, let's say I sit with somebody and I hear them raising their voice. Now, that the raised voice makes a certain impact on me, and through all the various cognitive filters that we have, emotional associations that we have, I then come to some kind of conclusion and I say, well, this person is perhaps angry. Now, then, that in and of itself is not necessarily being judgmental. It is when I then attribute something more to it, so they are being abusive, or they are bullying me, or they are dominating me, or they even if the judgment goes in the other direction, they are weak, or they are frightened, or whatever the case might be. I sort of add something to the raw perception. Raw perception isn't quite right. The perception as I become aware of it. So I suppose a filtered perception. But I add an additional kind of filter to that, and I attribute something to that perception. Now, in therapy, psychotherapy, we are generally trained to try and limit and hopefully, I don't know if we are ever capable of getting rid of it, but to limit it to the extent that we find possible. The judgmental nature of ourselves, so that we don't create a story on behalf of the patient. So when a person sits in therapy, he or she speaks to me and they are raising their voice at me, I don't attribute meaning to that raised voice, unless, of course, I know this person particularly well, and I can say, well, from previous experience, when this has happened in this context, speaking about this situation, this probably means the following. Now, of course, there is judgment it's a judgment call, but I don't think that's exactly the same as being judgmental. Okay. The fact that we practice this in therapy, and this is something that over time one hopes to also instill in the patient or the client, that they can also regard their own experience and behavior, at least initially, without that kind of judgmental attitude, so that one can remain interested in what one perceives. All right, so and that is also, I think, where this particular practice becomes valuable in the world outside of therapy. We try to pay attention to the people around us, the interactions, the things that we see on television or YouTube or whatever the case might be. And we can sometimes try to deliberately practice not adding anything to what we perceive, but rather to practice interest in, oh, okay, so sure, you are raising your voice. I wonder why that is happening. Not in a snarky kind of way where, oh, you're raising your voice at me. Whatever could that mean? Not as a further attempt to manipulate, but genuinely to sort of, so are you angry? Are you upset? What does this denote? What does this mean for you? So that we can pursue the meaning for the person. Now, I think it should go without saying that this is not an attitude or a practice that we will employ most of the time in our everyday run-of-the-mill kind of living. We want to remain spontaneous. We want to also be able to trust our own response, innate response to somebody else. But it should be clear from your own life experience that there are many situations in which we misread what is going on, misunderstand what something means to the other person. And in that attribution that we do, in that ascribing something to the other person, we in a sense misrepresent them. I think it should be fairly easy to see how in a professional situation, in a work setting, it might be very important when there is an attempt at genuine dialogue, at trying to genuinely understand the other person, how this might be useful. The very basic way that we are trained, and that we sometimes train other people, coach other people, is to say, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is the following, and in that you may remark on the fact, sure, when you say whatever you said, I hear there's quite a bit of intensity in your voice, and it 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 seems that you feel very strongly about it. So not to define the experience for them, but to accurately try and reflect something back to them so that they can then respond and say, well, yes, or no, you didn't quite get that, and to redefine and refine the communication, until we get to a place where there is an adequate kind of mutual understanding. All right, but all of this comes from a kind of attitude, and this attitude is what we can perhaps call being non-judgmental. So accepting what we perceive as we perceive it, and then trying to get as close to the truth of the subjective reality of the other person. This does not mean that we agree with them. And I think that's also important to understand. Just because somebody is, for instance, angry with us or somebody else, doesn't mean that they have a good reason to be angry. But again, we can't judge that until we have a clear understanding of what their reason might be. It's sort of a maxim that in the subjective experience of any individual, their behavior does make sense. Even if they are not always consciously aware of what that sense is. So, all right, so when we get as close to the truth as, well, that truth as possible, then perhaps we can negotiate, we can discuss, we can educate, we can shift our own position. So this is a very important attitude and a very important practice. So I hope this is useful. I hope that you can, in fact, try and practice some of this, and that you can discover just how malleable reality can be through the eyes of another person, and how often we change or shape reality with our own attributions. I hope this was helpful. I will follow up on this with some other talks on other aspects. I will speak with you again. Thank you for watching.